Good evening, welcome to Interface. I'm your host, Tembisa Magele. Black Lives Matter is a movement that has been gaining momentum following the killings of young black men by white police officers in the United States. People across the world are just outraged. Many are asking what can be done to stop this violence. And while the recent death of Philando Castile was captured on a smartphone and has raised some awareness, is social media really helping this campaign? These are some of the questions that we're going to be asking tonight on Interface. And to discuss this, I'm joined by Siyabonga Africa, who is a digital media specialist at SABC Digital News, and also Professor Malusilanga, who is a senior researcher at the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation, known as CSVR. Remember, if you would like to join in the discussion, you can always do so by finding us on Facebook at Interface on SABC or on Twitter at Interface on SABC or at Tembisa Magele. Thank you very much to both of you for joining us. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Tembisa. Thanks.
Siyabonga, we have a short amount of time with you, so let me start with you. Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Philando Castile, Alton Sterling, these are just some of the names that have made headlines because they've died at the hands of white police officers. But are the white policemen in the US, in your view, going out of their way to kill young black men, or is this just, part of the work that they do?
Well, if you look at the whole situation, the relationship between the African American community and the police has been one of a bit of animosity, and this can be traced back right through to the civil rights movement in the 60s and 50s, et cetera, et cetera. To say that they're going out of their way is a bit presumptive, but there's definitely been strife. A lot of it has to do with just the way that the structures have been placed. Sometimes you find situations where there are a majority of white police officers in areas which are predominantly black. So it really is a complex situation that has its roots in socioeconomics and just the way the situation has played out and how communities have developed.
But do you think that these killings are racially motivated?
I wouldn't really want to, make that assessment. It definitely, race does play a big factor into it. There's a number of other issues as well. You have the stand your ground legal binding that police are basically able to protect themselves if they feel as though they are in danger. So what you find is that a lot of police officers in these situations tend to, shoot a number of these black men because they believe that they are in mortal danger themselves, or use that as a justification. If you look at the argument that the police officer used with the Trayvon Martin case, even Eric Garner, they were saying that they felt they were in danger and thus they had to basically use more violent means to subdue, if not kill the person.
Prof, your thoughts on this? Is it just a case of, black men being so violent that they're the ones threatening the white police officers, and, you don't find white men threatening police officers in the same way, and that's why you don't see them killing them in the same way?
I mean, I think it would be quite unfair, to separate this from, race. Like in the US, we did, some bit of research, around racial profiling, which has been found to be a common practice.
Just explain what it is for us.
So basically, is that the stereotype amongst many police officers, like in the US, is that young black men are more likely to commit violent crimes. So obviously, when they go into spaces where there are a lot of young black men, they already go with this attitude. And then their view is that, look, you always need to be on the lookout. And in fact, we do not have any evidence of this unfounded fear of them being killed in the hands of young black men. If you look, except the Dallas sort of incident where 5 police officers were shot in the hands of a black man, it really happens where young black men target white police officers, for them then to justify that we need to be well prepared for instances where we can be killed in the hands of young black men. So for me, I think many of these killings are racially sort of motivated.
If I may interject
Sure.
as well, you find that in the US that crime is actually at an all-time low, which is why a lot of these incidents really seem unmotivated. Just like the professor says, it's very rare to find instances where black men actually target police in order to kill them. So this is why a lot of anger has arisen out of this.
Do you believe that this has been going on and is just being documented now in the way that it has because there is a campaign around it, because there's the social media power behind it? Or is there a new spate of, racial profiling and killings based on that?
No, not really. If you look at the 90s, we had the Rodney King riots, which were actually a result of the 4 police officers who were acquitted of basically beating up an African-American man. And this was caught on camera. This is 1992. You have the civil rights movements where you actually see police officers setting dogs loose on black protesters. This is nothing really new. Social media has just given it a platform where a lot more people can join in the actual documentation and mediation of such attacks. Basically the bleeding out and the death of Philando Castile that was live streamed by his fiancée is just one of many incidents like this.
So let's talk about that video. Dallas Police Chief David Brown said this, and I want to pose the question to you. I know how much we as a society need to scream about this to anyone who will listen. I know we have to take our outrage public if we're going to see it make any kind of change. But when watching a black man die goes viral, it makes the next grisly video of the same thing that much easier to stomach, that much more expected. So the question is, are these videos, in your view, these live videos, hurting or helping the Black Lives Matter movement and the cause for, no violence against black people in particular?
Well, there's two sides of the story here. On one side, you have the fact that now these incidents have become public, so it's no longer just an internal matter that the U.S. is dealing with. There's also the international perception. And the fact that, now that Black Lives Matter has more than just the support of people inside its own country, it has the support of everyone around the world. On the other hand, yes, the conditioning of these kinds of incidents does make it more and more of a common and daily occurrence that now we see young black men being killed on camera. So there is, the likelihood that, the conversation that we're having and the dialogue that we're having essentially just gets watered down as more and more of these videos come out. In effect, I think it does help because, people are now talking about it. There's evidence, there's, the actual material that we can go back to and say, look at this evidence, look at what's happened, and we've caught it on screen. And not only that, but it's now part of history in time.
But what about the truth of social media? So one of the things that is being said about this latest video is that by the time the lady in the video, the girlfriend of the late, I've forgotten his name now.
Castile.
Yes, Mr. Castile. By the time she recorded that, he was already dead. So the truth of social media is very selective in that it doesn't show us what happened before the shooting. It doesn't show us we actually shot him, but it shows us there's a black man, he's dead, and therefore we go with that narrative. How does social media play into that, in the truth space?
In terms of truth, social media and truth is a very touchy subject because things can be framed in such a way that a person can be perceived more negatively than they should be. Yes, we found that Philando Castile had passed away by the time the video had gone out, but at the same time it is out there. And now the question that people have to ask themselves is do they take this and work and use this as to fuel the conversation that needs to be had, or do they not believe this and just close their eyes and go on as is? I think the fact that it's out there actually helps people to have the conversation rather than say that rather than continue in a state of denialism, basically.
All right, thank you very much for your time. Thanks for coming through to talk to us. Siyabonga Africa from SABC Digital News. We continue with this conversation after the break, so do stay with us. Welcome Welcome back. This is Interface, and we are unpacking the violence in the U.S., and we're talking about the Black Lives Matter movement. In studio with me now is Professor Malusilanga, who is with the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation, and we're continuing the conversation here. Prof, let's look at the population stats. You've got the United States, which has a much smaller population than what we have in South Africa, and in terms of the number of people being killed by police officers, you've got more there than what we have here in South Africa. Why would that be?
I mean, obviously in South Africa, when it comes to killings of young black men, in the hands of the police, I mean the stats are very low as compared to in the US.
Yes.
Of course, in South Africa, I mean the number of cases that we have, it's more around assault, which are estimated to be more than 2,000 a year. And here I'm talking about reported cases. There are so many cases of young black men who are being beaten by the police, and more often they don't report their cases to relevant authorities. And of course, in the US, I mean it's a unique sort of situation to say, in fact, it was supposed to be the other way around.
Yes.
But given all the stereotypes, because even when you look at the present population, in the US, it is estimated that 80 to 85% of the inmates are African, American. And
let's just clarify, though, in terms of the population size overall, obviously they have more people than what we have here, as we saw in that graphic. But in terms of the number of people that are incarcerated or are dying at the hands of police, they've got more than we do. Is that normal?
I mean, given that their population size is high, one can say it's not normal, per se. But because even in terms of racial differences, that's where I think we need to look at, because it's mainly young black men, because it raises also questions around the criminal justice system, in the US, where many young black men, when you look at some of the proceedings, in court, there are a lot of questions that are being raised, where the number of the incarceration, it is very high. So obviously even young men that die, in the hands of white police, officers, it is abnormally high.
Prof, are police the world over becoming increasingly more violent in the way that they approach perceived crimes, or even just citizens in general? I mean, you're looking at what's happening in the US, but come back home. Let's look at Marikana. Let's look at, any of the other situations in the service delivery protests that we have here at home. Are police becoming more violent?
I mean, we're currently doing an international comparative sort of study, where we're looking at few countries, including Brazil, where young men, in the favelas. The favelas is our informal sort of settlements. The police brutality is very high. We're looking at Venezuela, in sort of informal sort of settlements. Police brutality is very high. We're also looking at Philippines. It's very high, and also looking at few African countries, including Sierra Leone. Again, is very high. In South Africa, we have many sort of incidents, including Marikana. So obviously, I think it raises questions around policing in general. In fact, it is not unique to the US. It's not unique to South Africa. It is a global sort of problem, and I think it raises questions on how police officers are being trained, and messages that they get when they're in colleges.
So you think it's more on the training side rather than more on the behavior of the police officers themselves, just based on their personal circumstances and other things?
I don't think it's sort of personal sort of circumstances. Because I mean, even a month ago, I mean, I did interviews, and in fact, as part of this international comparative study, where other interviews were done with other police officers in these countries that we're looking at, and all of them, they seem to be saying the same thing. To say, I don't know, in other countries, obviously they use different terms, like a station commander. I mean, they have the morning meetings and they get briefed, and then at times they're being told to say, we'll be going to this location, and when they go to certain locations, the brief then changes in terms of like in this, you need to be well armed and you need to put on your safety gears. And obviously, the
Like these
underlying
people are dangerous.
Yes, as compared to when they go to spaces that are considered to be like safe. So already there, it's not about, because even some police officers, even when you look at the Dallas case, some are even troubled because you have some black police officers. When they see some of these incidents, it reminds them of their own sort of upbringing. So I would not want to reduce it to personalities. It's more like around the system. Yeah.
So this brings me to this question. There are those that are saying, going back to the Black Lives Matter movement, those that are saying, why can't black people deal with the fact that there is a lot of crime in their communities, and if they deal with that crime, police won't then, need to be violent when they're dealing with the criminals within their communities?
I think that's a good question. But the unfortunate part, around, the Black Lives, movement, is the sustainability of the movement. And also whether we're asking the relevant sort of questions. Because the question around crime, what are the causes? The question of inequality cannot be left and then reduce this to a racial sort of issue. Because for me, why young black men find themselves in spaces where being violent, being a member of a gang is highly sort of celebrated. Also, are the options that these young black men can sort of explore, for them not to turn to gangs, So I'm of the opinion to say the movement need to start asking real questions. And real questions is more around the living conditions of young black men.
Well, we have to take a short break, and we are very interested in hearing what you have to say about this topic, as we always are here on Interface. So do hit us up on Facebook and on Twitter. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Stay with us. Welcome back. My guest today is the senior researcher at the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation, the CSVR, Professor Malusilanga, talking about what's happening in America, the Black Lives Matter movement, and also just generally what's happening with police here in South Africa as well. So, Black Lives Matter, Prof, is it really making a difference beyond highlighting that this is a problem,
Yeah, I think in terms of raising awareness around the issue, the movement is making some difference. If you read some of the placards, I mean, they have very powerful messages. No justice, no peace. We need to do something around the issue of.
But is something being done about it? I mean, we live in a country where we are very free to take to the streets anytime we feel there is a problem. But are we really making the change that we need to be seeing on the ground?
Not really. I mean, because and that's the unfortunate part about the movement, that the awareness is there, but it has not translated to anything tangible. I mean, in terms of this, killings, believe me, this is not the last incident to sort of happen.
Why is that, though? Why, when you've got powerful messages coming from the White House, coming from other world leaders, everybody condemning this, everybody saying, no, this cannot happen, and then you have, as in the case of one of the people that were killed, where the evidence was submitted in court of the guy saying, these guys are killing me, and still they were acquitted.
Yeah, I think it's a question of, the system has remained the same. The economic conditions have remained the same. So obviously the chances of these incidents reoccurring are very high. So I think we need to get to a point where we really use these incidents to, I guess make a radical sort of change. And this change cannot only be at condemning the killings, but it's more around how do you also transform the racially biased sort of criminal justice system.
And the sniper attack that you spoke about earlier that killed those 5 police officers, and it was African-American men that killed those police officers and wounded about 6. Yeah. What do you think that has done to the strength of the movement?
I mean, obviously, I think it has done two things. I mean, one is to show the anger. I mean, to say if this continues, the chances of us also, I mean, arming ourselves and targeting wide police officers, it's very high. But on the other hand, it raises questions around easy access to this guns, in the US.
But haven't they been talking about that forever? Gun control laws, they make it
which is very sad that recently, after this mass shooting in Orlando, I mean, there was a big call around the need to tighten or control gun ownership. But the Congress, which it boggles my mind, that it voted against a tighter gun law control in the US. So it is very easy for people to get guns and start killing people.
Yeah, and those that say all lives matter, why must we have a campaign that says Black Lives Matter? Why can't we just say all lives matter and let's keep it at the humanitarian level?
I think that would be short-sighted, to say all lives, yes, all lives matter, but to then remove that Black lives matter, it would be very short-sighted, because race does play a central role in this. So we cannot downplay race to say all lives matter. Because when you look at the stats are quite telling.
And whenever you have movements like this, there are those that, say, oh, no, you're being racist now because you're focusing on a certain segment of society. I want to read you this quote that says, if it is not up to Black Lives Matter or any other movement led by and for communities of color to make space to articulate a vision for white people. The expectation that black leaders and movements should automatically do so is a subtle extension of the sort of white-centric entitlement that gives rise to the need for such movements in the first place. Question then becomes, if you've got people within the police force, if you've got people within the American community, white people that say, Black lives do matter, I would like to join into this movement, I'd like to support it, how do they show support?
I mean, I've also been reading comments like this, and it even goes back. I mean, if we quickly come to our South African sort of context, like in the 60s and even following the June sort of 16, there were people quickly, I mean, trying to answer sort of question, around where people started making accusations to say black consciousness movement is racist, is anti white people, and so on and so forth. And in fact, it's the opposite of that. And even with Black Lives matters sort of movement, it is for white people to join in. But obviously, in cases like this, it's not to put whiteness sort of at the center, because what is at the center here, it is the life of young black men. So obviously, for them, is to also come and partake in some of these activities, because what tends to happen if these movements do not become very sort of specific in terms of what is the issue here at hand, because it's not the issue of people are being killed. It is young black men who are being killed.
Do you think this is sustainable, this movement? Do you think it's going to continue?
The unfortunate part of the movement is not very sustainable, because my issue, it is more reactionary than being proactive. And being proactive is to use these incidents, like I said earlier on, to raise real issues.
I wish we had more time for you to unpack what more they should be doing that they're not doing right now. But thank you so much for coming through to talk to us. We have to leave it there. Professor Malusi Langa, who is with the CSVR. And of course, we would love to hear from you. So let's continue the conversation on social media. For now, goodbye.